Hello everyone, and in today's video, we're going to be covering over the FV4101 Charioteer tank, which was a tank that was designed by the British in the 1950s as a stopgap design to supply the British units that desperately needed a more powerful tank that could deal with the later Soviet tanks, such as the IS-3 and T-34-85. The origins of the tank would be at the very end of the 1940s, as Britain at the time was in the middle of developing newer tanks that could better counter these Soviet tanks. These designs would mainly consist of the Centurion medium tank and the Conqueror heavy tank. But there were problems present in each tank. The Conqueror itself was stuck in development hell owing due to the British inexperience with developing larger caliber anti-tank guns that could be fitted within the tank without it damaging the tank itself. The Centurion, whilst it was in production, was still nowhere the required output to supply British units overseas, which was further hampered by Britain itself being in the middle of an economic downturn after the war, and as a result, funds for the military were extremely hard to come by. But with the escalating tensions with the Soviets that put to sleep any peace with the Soviet power, especially after the Soviets seizing control of the Eastern Bloc countries, which would ultimately lead to the Western powers beginning the establishment of NATO. And soon after that, the tight treasury coffers was then relaxed, and money began to flow more readily into the military. But this still left the problem with many of the British forces overseas being ill-equipped to deal with the newer Soviet tanks, namely fielding the older Churchill heavy tank, as well as the Comet and Cromwell cruiser tank, of which their guns were determined to not be adequate against the newer Soviet tanks. One of the limiting factors on why these tanks were equipped with a relatively weak gun was due to the small turret ring size of their tanks, which prevented the installation of larger turrets. One of the quick and easy solutions that was put forward was to modify one of their surplus tanks with a 83.8mm 20-pounder gun that was recently developed, with this gun's ammunition being able to penetrate the T-34 and IS-3 tanks, especially with its new APDS round or armor-piercing discarding sabot. But this gun was even larger than the 17-pounder gun in size, which made it impossible to mount the 20-pounder gun in any existing surplus tank turrets. After some time, the British establishment would then decide to modify the Cromwell cruiser tank, since the tank itself was still very mobile compared to the Charioteer tank, and there was a large amount of surplus hulls available as many of them would begin to retire from service. Not only that, the British also had some experience with previous tanker versions of the Cromwell tank, thanks to the A-30 Challenger tank. There would be several changes made to the Cromwell design. The hull had to first be modified with the whole upper roof plate being extended slightly, allowing the turret ring size to be increased to a diameter of 68.775 inches, allowing for a much larger turret to be mounted. One Cromwell Mark IV tank was then reworked in 1951 at the Royal Ordnance Factory in Dalmenor to the Mark VII standard, along with the increased turret ring size. The tank would then be sent to a firm in Lanarkshire, where a wooden mock-up of the turret would be constructed and then mounted for demonstration purposes. Shortly thereafter, a metal version of the turret would be constructed and it would be mounted to the tank. The turret itself would be larger than the standard turret of a Cromwell tank, but not as tall as the A-30 Challenger tank's turret, as the requirement for the turret was that it was to only have 2 crew members within the turret instead of 4. This was done because of the 20-pounder gun bridge and ammunition being a deal larger than the 17-pounder gun. The armor thickness of the turret would only be lightly armored, with around 38mm frontally, and the size being around at most 25mm thick. But the armor didn't really matter, as tank guns were now quickly approaching and even far exceeding 200mm of penetration at range, and the British was far more concerned with getting a functional tank with a 20-pounder gun to frontline units. There was an initial problem with the turret as the gun couldn't fire if the gun was elevated at a high enough angle, as the gun breech block would hit the turret rim edge due to the recoil when it fired. To solve this problem, the turret would be made slightly taller than initially planned. Another change to the tank would be the removal of the hull gunner to make way for additional ammo storage. But even so, the tank could only carry around 25 rounds for its 20-pounder gun. The other changes was that the tank tracks was then widened to 15.5-inch tracks, assumedly to improve the handling characteristics of the tank. With regards to the specification of the tank's length would be around 8.8 meters, width would be around 3.1 meters, and the height being around 2.6 meters. It would be equipped with a 83.8mm Royal Ordnance QF 20-pounder gun with 25 rounds of ammunition. It would have an elevation arc of +10 to -5 degrees, and a coaxial machine gun would finish the tank's firepower. Armor would be around 64mm at the front of the hull, with the sides and rear being around 38mm thick. The turret armor was just as light, at only 38, 25 and 30mm thick on its front, side and rear. The tank would weigh around 28.5 to 30 tons according to the various sources, and it would be powered by a 600 horsepower Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, giving the tank a top speed of 32 miles per hour or 53 kilometers per hour, with a range of 150 miles on road and a 70-mile range on cross-country terrain. When the design was then improved, an order for 1,000 tank conversions was then placed, but this would be quickly reduced down to 630, and it was then further reduced to 442. The main reason for this reduction was that the Ministry of Supply at the time didn't have any spare personnel to work on the tanks. Plus, there was still a heavy demand for Cromwell cruiser tanks that was equipped with a 95mm howitzer for a close support row, which eaten into both the supply and spare manpower that was available. The conversion work was assigned to a company called Robertson's and Kershaw's Ironworks from 1951 to 1952, with some of the tanks also being handled by the Royal Ordnance factories. During midway through the conversion batch, a newer version of a 20-pounder gun with a fume extractor would be equipped on the later converted tanks, and the tanks would be labelled Charioteer A and Charioteer B, with the letter B denoting what tank was equipped with a fume extractor. The Charioteer tank primarily would see service with the British Army and its territorial army, but it would also see service in several other countries. These are Austria, Kuwait, Finland, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine. Initially, the main British Army would be the first ones served with Charioteer tanks, with the territorial armies receiving theirs later. But the latter would receive a reduced number of tanks, with them going through a military reform in the 1950s, which saw the amount of Charioteer tanks that were allocated to the territorial armies being reduced. While in service with the British, one of the sample tanks, 02 ZW78, was then tested over a period of 29 months up until May of 1957, during which the tank proved quite reliable, as there was very little that went worn outside of the usual wear and tear of components. But there were a few complaints with the tank that was echoed across the units. When the Charioteer's gun was fired, the amount of smoke that was generated from the gun obscured the visual vision of the commander whilst he looked through the periscopes, and so for the commander to see if any target was hit required him to stick his head out the turret. Another problem would also be felt quite heavily by the territorial army, as the cost for a single 20-pounder shell was around £20 in the 1950s. For comparison, the cost of a 17-pounder shell was more than 5 times cheaper at only £3.60, which meant that the gun was very rarely even fired. Later on in life, the British would then modify one of their Charioteer tanks to be mounted with an L7 105mm gun to test if it was feasible to operate the gun on the Charioteer tank. It was initially intended for the export market, and as interest in this tank variant was non-existent, only a testbed would be made. The other nations that would receive the Charioteer tank would be Austria, who would receive around, according to the export reports, around 80 tanks. Although Austrian sources state that only 56 tanks were in Austrian service, and they would be used from 1956 to 1965. When the tanks were then retired from service, the turrets of some of the tanks were then taken off and were mounted as static defences on various bunker systems, which can still be seen today. Finland would also receive some, with around 16 tanks on export reports, but according to Finnish sources, they state that they would receive around 3 of the Model B that was bought in 1958, and then a further purchase of 35 tanks in the 1960s. The Charioteer tanks would remain in service with the Finnish army until in 1972, where it was then relegated to a training role, which continued until 1980, where 50 of them would then be stored before being auctioned off in 2007. Finland would also attempt at modifying the Charioteer tank with a L7 105mm gun, and they would ask Britain for some guns. But the export permit for the L7 wasn't yet granted at the time, and shortly thereafter, interest in the development quickly dried up. Another country that would operate the Charioteer tank would be Jordan, who would operate around 2 squadrons of Charioteer tanks in their 3rd Tank Regiment in 1954, before some were then sold to Lebanon, with these particular tanks being upgraded with an electric turret ring drive and the fitting of a 50 cal machine gun mounted on top of a commander's cupola. It's here the Charioteer tank would see action with the Lebanese army during the Lebanese Civil War of 1975 to 1990 and the South Lebanon War of 1978, during which the Lebanese army disintegrated due to infighting, and several militias would acquire some Charioteer tanks, with some falling into the hands of Palestinian-based militias. Israel would also be a nation that would acquire some Charioteer tanks during the South Lebanon War, where they assisted the South Lebanese army. And it's been confirmed that at least one Model A and one Model B of a Charioteer tank was acquired, with one of them being on display in the museum today in Israel. But by the turn of the 1980s, most of the Charioteer tanks were withdrawn from service, although still to this day you can see numerous examples of Charioteer tanks in the various museums located in Austria, Finland, Israel, Jordan and the UK. And that was the history of the FV4101 Charioteer tank. Thanks for watching this video. If you like this content, please put a like and subscribe to get more videos like this. If you have a vehicle that you want to know about, let us know in the pinned comment section down below.